Well, last but not least, before everyone is going to get ready for the gala in hopefully a lot of amazing dresses and tuxedos, I would like to welcome Andrew, who, actually does it all. He is a scientist, a computational biologist, presenter, campaigner, YouTuber, and author of the great book, Ageless, The New Science of Getting Older Without Getting Old, a practical guide to the science of aging. Welcome, Andrew.
Thank you very much indeed, and thank you for that very kind introduction. So as you just heard, I'm Andrew Steele. Hello, everyone. And I'm a physicist turned biologist turned author and presenter and YouTuber and campaigner and all kinds of other things. And I was hoping to talk to you this evening about talking about aging. And the reason I wanted to do that is because, I assume most of us in this room have broadly the same goal, which is to generate these therapies that can target specific aspects of the aging process, delay or prevent a whole range of different diseases with single treatments. But I think there's a huge obstacle to this, and I think the biggest obstacle isn't a scientific obstacle, it's a social one. The obstacle that we face is that there's a chronic lack of awareness of this field in the wider public, and not just in the public. You can see that my talk is entitled Scientists, Policymakers, and the Public, and if the rule of three wasn't a powerful rhetorical thing, I'd probably have added doctors and investors into that as well. And in spite of the fact that obviously it's very important to tailor your message to your audience, when you talk to a lot of people about this stuff in very diverse backgrounds, you find that a lot of the same challenges come up when trying to communicate regardless of the audience that you're speaking to. And those challenges are firstly that people have never heard of it, or if they have, there can often be outright hostility. The most common question I get after one of my talks isn't anything about the biology, it's won't that cause terrible overpopulation and destroy the environment if we develop these treatments? And so people often fall on this spectrum somewhere from not knowing to apathy to thinking it's a hugely negative thing that we should be doing this. And I hope that I can communicate with you some strategies about how to try and communicate with this, to communicate with all kinds of different groups about this subject. So to give a bit of my story, because I think it's actually quite a good example, I got as far as doing a PhD in physics before I'd really read anything about aging biology. And what that shows you is that you can get to quite an advanced level of science without necessarily having been exposed to this at all. And I then decided, I was trying to work out how to have the biggest impact on the world with my life, that I'd move into computational biology to try and understand a bit more about aging. And during about 5 years working as a computational biologist, I found that I was often the most knowledgeable person in the room when it came to aging biology. And this wasn't because my colleagues were terrible. I was working with some very smart people from great institutions. They got great degrees, great PhDs from great universities. But I just happened to have read a few books and read a few papers, got a bit into the literature about aging biology. And quite often you can go through an amazing biology, biochemistry degree and not have a single lecture on what is one of the most universal processes in biology. I also met my wife during this time. My wife's a doctor, and when I first started talking to her about the idea of treating, or heaven forbid, curing aging, I think she thought I was totally mad. Now, hopefully the fact she is now my wife illustrates that I do have some credibility in convincing people about this stuff. But it really shows you, again, she's of an age where she's just starting her medical career. She's quite likely to be prescribing some of the geroprotective treatments that people in this room have been talking about for the last few days, and yet she's never had a lecture on it. So how on earth is she supposed to go into this equipped? And this is the scale of the sort of lack of awareness that we face, because aging biology has been a small field historically. That's really perpetuated this problem. So I ended up deciding I wanted to quit and write a book, because I thought that aging biology needs a sort of PR makeover as much as it does more scientific advancement. And the real sort of goal that I've got in writing this book, in talking to people about this stuff, is to increase the public funding for this research. Because although we've got some great investable opportunities that people are moving into, actually a lot of this stuff needs more basic research to get it to the point where investors can swoop in and pharma companies can start turning these things into treatments. So what I found through doing talks, interviews, all kinds of different things, is that aging is a really easy conversation to start, because everybody's aging. Everyone wants to know how to slow down their aging. Everyone's intrigued by the idea of living longer and healthier. But it's a really difficult conversation to navigate well and ensure that the person that you're talking to about it comes away with the right understanding of this field and doesn't think it's some kooky thing billionaires do or some environmental disaster waiting to happen. So I thought the way that I'd start this is by giving you a sort of abbreviated version of a talk that I might give to a general audience, but with a bit of fourth wall breaking sort of director's commentary as I go through. And the slide that I always start with is a very simple graph. I'm actually surprised. This is perhaps the first longevity commentary I've been. I don't think I've seen this graph put up on any of the slides, but this is one that you see obviously in an awful lot of talks. It's just the risk of death versus how old you are. And crucially, it's plotted on a linear scale. And I think most people know that older people are more likely to die, but just how much continues to shock me. So if you plot it, the numbers look something like this. And I think it's worth, even if you're an expert in this stuff, just reminding yourself of what this looks like. I know this is much more commonly plotted on a log scale. That makes a lot more sense if you're talking to an expert audience, particularly if you care about deaths at young ages. But honestly, we experience death on a linear scale, not a logarithmic one. So this is what I'm staring down, what all of us are staring down as living humans. And just putting some numbers to this can really show the striking increase in risk of death. So my favorite statistic is that 10-year-olds are the current safest humans in the history of humanity. They've got a less than 1 in 10,000 chance of not making their 11th birthday. But unfortunately, it's all downhill, or rather uphill, on this graph from there. I'm 37. I've got about a 1 in 1,000 chance of dying this year. And I quite like those odds. That means if that were to continue for the rest of my life, I'd live into my 1,030s on average. Now, of course, unfortunately, that doesn't continue. Our risk of death doubles about every 8 years. So by the time you're 65, you've got about a 1% chance of not making your next birthday. Someone in their 80s has a greater than 5%, more than 1 in 20 chance of dying every year. And if I'm fortunate enough to live into my 90s, but unfortunate enough that none of the breakthroughs that we've been talking about this week have actually come to pass, I'll have a risk of death greater than 1 in 6. That's life and death at the roll of a dice. And that's just a staggering change. What is it that's going on in our biology that causes this increase in risk of death? And obviously, that's ultimately what motivates us to do this research. But I think showing these numbers and actually sort of going through them slowly is a really good way to illustrate to people quite how stark the changes related to aging are. The other thing that's really important to bring up is I think there's this very common myth that when you get older, older people are more likely to die, but you basically just get a bit wrinkly, you get a bit grey, you slowly, maybe get a little bit more frail. But it's possible just to go to bed one night and then fairly painlessly just not wake up the next morning. But of course, the other common graph that you often see is not just your chance of death, but your chance of illness per year. And if I plot some of my favorite, least favorite illnesses, you can see that, again, these things all increase exponentially with age. I think it's really worth trying to disabuse people of this idea that you can have a healthy aging process. Because one of the problems with something like heart disease, a lot of people again assume you can just have a heart attack and fall over and be dead, and don't see the decades or longer of preceding gradual loss of function, inability to play with your grandkids, get on with your hobbies, travel, whatever it is you love to do, that these things represent. And you might think that this is a problem that we in the rich world are sort of perversely lucky enough to have. Maybe we're fortunate enough to live long enough to experience these terrible diseases. So it's very important to talk about global life expectancy as well. Now, I often do this as a quiz, and I thought since I'm in a room full of aging experts, it would be fun to do this as a quiz as well. So can everyone stand up for me, please? What's going to happen now is that I'm going to flash some numbers up on the board. And when you see a number, come on everybody, don't be shy. When you see a number, if you think that global life expectancy is at or below that number, I would like you to sit down. So as a start of a 10, this one's for free, flash at 40 years. Anyone who thinks global life expectancy, that is the average life expectancy for every country in the world, is 40 years or less, sit down now. It's not, don't sit down. Okay, so now we're going to ratchet up things a little bit faster. 50 years, anyone for 50 years for global life expectancy? Anyone for 60 years, average life expectancy around the world? 65 years? 70 years? Got a few more people. So most people have sat down by now. We have got a few die-hard, I guess is quite a good term, optimists. 75 years. Aubrey sat down, that may be a hint. 80 years? I think we finally lost everyone. Some people are still standing by 85 years. The actual answer is 72.6 years old. And by far the majority of you had sat down by the time we got to that age, right? And that's because, you shouldn't feel too hard on yourselves, by the way. If you do this in the general population, most people get it wrong. And if you do it among university graduates, a higher percentage of people get it wrong. So it's almost as though the education system makes us stupider in this respect. We imagine there's some enormous developing world where everyone's really poor and the health interventions are terrible, sanitation's really bad, nutrition's awful, and so people are all dying incredibly young. But what this means if we transpose it onto this graph is that most people in most countries are now living long enough to get a significant way up this curve. And in fact, of course, global population, the life expectancy is rising. And so we're moving further and further up here. This isn't a problem that's relegated to the rich world. It's actually responsible for 2/3 of deaths globally, if you add up all the different causes of death that aging is responsible for. 3/4. I think I got 70% when I did this. And that's another thing that's very difficult about communicating this stuff, is that often it's down to people like me and Aubrey to make a sort of educated guess calculation based on statistics we can find. And there's very rarely a good paper that you can point to when you want to do this kind of stuff. So if there are any demographers in the audience who want to do a better job than we have done, then please be my guest and allow me to give a sort of more accurate number when I'm talking about these things. The good news is that having given that incredibly depressing introduction and shown how we're all facing this exponential wall of mortality, nature has gifted us with some incredibly charismatic animals that have incredibly long and fascinating lifespans. And this is one of my favorite. The Galapagos tortoise adorns the cover of a few versions of my book. Not only can these things live to 175 plus years, but more interestingly, their risk of death doesn't change as adults. That means they've got no increased risk of disease, no increased risk of frailty. Obviously, they're not particularly fast, moving around at 150, but they're no slower than they were aged 50 years old. And so what this shows us is that not only is curing aging not against the laws of physics, because often people think it's something to do with entropy, things are sort of falling apart and there's nothing we can do about it. It's not even against the laws of biology, because we have animals that, by this statistical definition at least, literally do not age. And I think whatever audience you're talking to, this is a really powerful example, because this is a living, breathing, actual creature, which is doing the thing that we're all hoping that medical science will enable human beings to do. So, the hallmarks of talking about aging. The first thing is to guide people gently. And I'm sorry for any experts in the room who are absolutely familiar with everything I've just told you. But remember, I've had a decade to indoctrinate myself with this stuff. I'm thoroughly convinced by all of these arguments. But when people are introduced to these ideas for the very first time, it's even surprising how large the increase in risk of death and disease is with age. And you have to slowly take people through this idea, because aging is often seen as a positive thing. That's not to say there's nothing positive about it. Getting older, getting wiser, having kids, having grandkids, playing with it, having an expanded family. These can all be fantastic things. But what we really want to emphasize is the medical problems of aging, which are often overlooked. So guide people through this idea slowly, because as much as you may be completely convinced, someone who's experiencing this for the first time, I'd be fascinated to go back and talk to 2010 Andrew and find out what his first question was when told about this stuff. The second thing is really stick as best you can to solid science. I know there's some fascinating stuff happening on the fringes of current science, but you do not need to go, talk about the very, very latest and shakiest developments in order to make this case. And actually, it's really, really important when you're talking to the public that you do stick to this solid stuff. Because if the shaky thing that you told them about later turns out to be false, then that just undermines credibility in the whole field. But I think this does leave space for tempered by realism, optimism. And the reason is, for example, I think it would be bold, shall we say, to say that we're going to cure aging in the next 5 or 10 years. But equally, it can definitely happen in time for most people alive today, which is normally the way that I put this. And the reason I say that is that the average age of somebody on planet Earth is under 40. And that means even if they only, quote unquote, make it to 80 years old, they've then got another 40 years ahead of them for scientists to do the research, for pharma companies to turn these things into actual products. And then potentially, if they can benefit from those first products, of course, they can live longer still and benefit from the next generation of treatments and so on. So you don't have to make wild predictions in order to give people an optimistic, take-home message. It's also important to give concrete examples, and for time constraints, I haven't really done this. But the reason I've called this the hallmarks of talking about aging is I love the hallmarks of aging. I know that that's not a universally popular opinion among people who are researching this, and the sort of network effects between them are a really crucial thing to uncover. I agree. But when you're talking to a general audience, there's something very powerful about specific biological processes that you can point to. You can say, this is a thing, it changes with age, we can intervene in that thing, and we can reduce the risk of diseases. And honestly, my favorite example continues to be senescent cells. And that's because senescent literally means old. These are old cells. Developmental biologists, please do not write in. But these are old cells that accumulate in our bodies as we age. As these cells accumulate, lots and lots of diseases seem to accompany them. We have drugs and other treatments that can go in and remove these cells. You take away the bad thing, and then people or mice at least, get healthier, and they get less cancer, they live for longer, they even look better. You can show people a picture of these things. These are incredibly powerful interventions if you're talking from a communications point of view. Hopefully they'll turn out to be scientifically powerful as well. Fingers very much crossed that they actually do work in practice. But I think this is just a real way to illustrate, from people who are used to something like cancer care or the way that we treat heart disease, they might not be used to the idea of preventative medicine where we go in before people are ill in the first place. But if you can give an example of something that builds up, something that changes in our body with age, and a way of getting rid of it, I just think that the hallmarks and senescent cells in particular, if you haven't got another favorite one you want to talk about, is a really good place to start. And number 5 is be ready for ethical concerns, and that's a big feature of the next half of the talk. Because again, although everyone in this room is probably broadly bought into the idea that treating aging is a huge ethical positive for humanity, it's also the case that someone who experiences this for the first time will almost inevitably have big ethical questions. And as I said, the most common of those is overpopulation. So I'll be getting onto that in a second. And that leads to this question, should we cure aging? Even if we can, it's almost, the can is almost taken as a given in quite a lot of situations. It's the follow-on question of, if we've been given this incredible power, should we choose to use it? And actually, it's sort of weird to be asked these kinds of questions, because if I decided to write a book on cancer research or a book on dementia research, nobody would stick their hand up after my talks and say, Andrew, are you not worried that all these childhood leukemia survivors are going to get bored with all the extra years of life that you've imbued them with? But when you're talking about aging, suddenly people put it in a very separate moral, ethical category. And I think that there are obviously some very specific answers to particular questions, and I would urge people who talk about this in public to familiarize themselves with those answers, because it's important to not just give generalizations, but get down to the nitty-gritty. But there are two very good general responses to these kinds of concerns. The first one is this is just medical research. If you compare this to someone who is working on cancer, for example, what are they trying to do? They're trying to develop a treatment that will improve someone's lifespan, improve their health span. Maybe they're looking to improve their health and their lifespan as a side effect, very much like people who are trying to work on the biology of aging. The only difference, really, between the biology of aging and the biology of a specific disease is perhaps that the aging biology stuff is more likely to have a big effect, and perhaps that's therefore something that could something that causes people some concern. But it's very hard to come up with any ethical argument. I've certainly never come across one where you can clearly draw a line and say aging research falls on this side and dementia research or cancer research or something else falls on the other side of that line. I think it's just a continuum. And once you can sort of get this idea into place that it's just a form of preventative medicine like a vaccination, then that makes it much, much easier to have the conversation. My second favorite argument that's very useful in general terms is something called the reversal test. And actually, this is hugely useful for all kinds of human or technological or other kinds of progress. And it's to say, if we switch the question around, would you change your answer? And if you would, perhaps you're not being entirely morally consistent with yourself. So for example, imagine that, or since overpopulation is the most common question I get, imagine you lived in a world where there are 20 billion people. The world is absolutely heaving. We're emitting far too much carbon dioxide. We're filling the oceans with plastic. We're destroying all of the land for use as farmland and so on and so on. What would you do if that world didn't have aging? So people were living much longer, healthier lives. Would you create aging to try and solve that overpopulation problem? I would suggest you probably wouldn't. The first thing you'd probably do is try and cut back your carbon emissions, reduce the impact of the food that you use on land use and so on. And if all of that didn't work, if you threw absolutely everything at environmental technology and you still couldn't manage it, and you decided the only way to solve this was to kill people, I would suggest that should be, by the way, an option very much of last resort. Would you decide to do it by introducing this decades-long process of disease and decline in order to get people off the face of the earth? I don't think you would. And I think that by switching the question around, it then illustrates that you shouldn't be trying to slow down aging research as a primary intervention to try and save the environment. We should be putting more money into research that will reduce carbon emissions, research that will clean up plastic pollution, research that will allow food footprints to be smaller on the planet, and so on. And so I think when you switch the question around, you can make a lot of these ethical problems seem much, much clearer. Would you invent aging to kill a particularly brutal dictator and thereby take down probably more of his subjects than he's already tormenting, and so on and so on? This test is just an incredibly powerful general argument against some of the objections to treating aging. I thought I'd finish with a quick roundup of don'ts. These are not hard and fast. You can't always stick to them, but there are lots of things that you can try and avoid when talking to journalists, when talking to members of the public, and so on, about aging biology. And I'm going to give these in a sort of series of examples of fake headlines. The first, breaking news. Aging experts say humans could live to 200. And this is from a very personal story that I'll tell in a second. I think it's really important to try not to fixate on specific lifespan numbers. And the reason for that is that there are several. The first is that I don't think we really know the answer to this. Because as I've already alluded, I think the way that we're going to ultimately end up treating and maybe curing aging is by developing a succession of treatments that slowly add a few years of lifespan here, a few years of lifespan there. So it's very hard to say how long someone who's 20 years old today could live. If this stuff happens quickly, it could be a very long time. If it happens slowly, they might live to 100 and just have a fairly normal lifespan. Secondly, I think there's a real challenge here when you're trying to choose your number. So you could be like, aging research means everyone alive today will be able to live to 90, which is actually kind of boring, because quite a lot of people alive today probably will live that long. Or you can say, everyone alive today is going to live to 200, in which case, to a lot of people, that sounds weird and kooky and sci-fi, and they're going to switch off at that point, even if you personally might think that's quite a desirable age to live to. It also seems weird, because if people are living to 200, are you seriously saying in the next 150 years we're not going to develop significantly improved aging technologies that's going to mean people live even longer? So giving a number is really hazardous. But the problem is that journalists love these numbers. So this is an experience I had. A journalist from the Daily Mail sent me an email asking if I could comment on this paper. It's got a real clickbait title, Diverse Aging Rates in Ectothermic Tetrapods. So this is basically a paper about long-lived tortoises. It was quite interesting. I gave a few comments. We had a bit of a back and forth about the paper. And finally, as a sort of follow-up question, I got, is it possible that people could reach as old as 200 at some point, sort of like a tortoise? To which I replied, I can't see a physical or biological reason why people couldn't live to 200. The challenge is whether we can develop the biomedical science to make it possible. A few days later, I opened my web browser to why living to 200 really isn't a pipe dream. Dr. Andrew Steele told Mail Online there is no reason humans cannot reach the age of 200 or even beyond. Now, this then proceeded to go around the world. It was reported by other newspapers. It made it into Lad Bible, if any of you are familiar with that publication. It got onto Instagram, got over 600,000 likes on something called Rap, with the headline, "Medicine that could let humans live to 200 is being developed. Would you all take this?" So asking the big important questions there. I even got onto this Indian news channel. I have absolutely no idea what's going on. That's my face, that's a lab coat, there's my name, there's that number 200. So clearly stories like this have legs. I'm not saying never give a lifespan estimate, but this is the risk if you do. This is the fate that may befall you. Another headline to try studiously to avoid is breaking news. Silicon Valley gajillionaires spend huge amounts of money trying to live forever. Now, we've seen quite a lot of this stuff, I think, in the last few years. And the reason I think this is counterproductive is that it can make longevity science, again, sound weird. We need to, this is normal medicine. It's not that we need to convince people this is normal medicine. It is. But if their first exposure to it is through some tech tycoon who's spending huge amounts of money to try and reverse their own aging or to try and invest in companies that will slow down the aging process, it makes this stuff seem completely out of reach of normal people. I haven't got millions of dollars a year to be spending on my own aging biology. And honestly, even if I did, I'm not sure I'd spend it on anything in particular other than perhaps doing a bit more exercise and eating better, at least until the drugs are available. And the other challenge is that even if you look at people who are investing in aging, you saw a lot of these stories when Jeff Bezos was part of this investment in Altos Labs. I don't know what Jeff Bezos is thinking. And he may be doing it entirely for narcissistic reasons because he wants to live long enough to spend all of his billions. But equally, this could just be an incredibly canny investment he's made here. It could be bigger than his investment in Amazon if this all turns out well, because the potential market for treatments that Altos develops is every living human. It might be a humanitarian gesture. I've already made the case in this talk that aging is our biggest cause of suffering on planet Earth. And so, I don't know what Jeff Bezos' personal motivations are, but there are all kinds of ways that you can steer this conversation that aren't just about him being a massive narcissist. And the other thing, this is another ethical question where it's just really important to be familiar with the counter-arguments. Because actually, a lot of the proposed anti-aging treatments could well be super cheap. If you're looking at things that are off-patent drugs, then they can cost cents per dose to manufacture. And often drugs are cheap as soon as they have made it off the patent cycle. So there are sort of details to be familiar with as well. Another classic headline, "Stop the press! Aging experts say key to long life is not smoking, eating well, and exercise." I've been involved in quite a lot of articles where this has basically been the takeaway because people ask you for my health advice, and I say something a little bit like this. Again, this isn't to say never give this health advice. I think things like this are very much correct. But I think there are several risks when giving health advice as an aging biologist. The first thing is it's important not to focus on the sort of out there stuff and potentially reduce the credibility of the field. Although, comments under these kinds of headlines are, oh my God, these experts, how are they experts? They're just giving this incredibly obvious sort of mother's advice. But if you do give some sort of more out there kooky advice, which then later turns out to be nonsense or, just turns out to be weird, then I don't think that's going to bring people along with the message either. But I also think it's really important not to just talk about health advice. So whenever someone calls me up and says, you're an aging biologist, I'd love to talk to you about how to live longer, I really try very hard to steer the conversation onto more interesting topics. And the way that I normally do that is I say the best health advice, if you're already not smoking, eating well, and exercising, is to spread the word about aging biology. Because the single thing that's going to move the needle the most in terms of your lifespan, in terms of the lifespan of everyone that you care about, you love, people you don't know all around the world, is getting more funding and therefore more advances into this field. You can't exercise and diet and not smoke your way to living to 100 with current technology. And so we're going to have to develop something if that's something that you aspire to do. And the most important thing, regardless of the headline that you're trying to sort of comment underneath, is to keep your eyes on the prize. And for me, this is very much the prize. This slide shows you the cost of various chronic diseases, which are obviously primarily aging-related, just to the US. And you can see that all of these diseases cost hundreds of billions of dollars to the United States every year. We can compare and contrast that to the National Institute of Aging. The US has an institute that's solely devoted to funding this kind of research of $3.5 billion. Of course, that square is in proportion to the size of the amount of money. And there's also a running joke within biogerontology that I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with, that NIA doesn't actually stand for National Institute on Aging, but National Institute on Alzheimer's disease. And that's because most of that money goes into the neuroscience division. It's looking at things like Alzheimer's and dementia. There are then some other things that the NIA does. And the actual aging biology earmarked part of the budget is just $350 million. That's a bit more than $1 per American. And this is for something that kills 85% of Americans. That seems like an investment that's wildly out of whack here. The economic cost, the human cost is just hugely, hugely in excess of the amount of money that we're investing. And I think that increasing the size of that pie is the single most important thing that anybody in here can try and do. So this is a really challenging thing to do. The demands are high. If you want to chat about this stuff convincingly in a way that's going to bring people on board, you've got to be familiar not just with the science, but also the politics, the ethics, the sort of wider social considerations. It's a really tough thing to do. But I think if done well, this is a really important aspect of what the field's doing. I think tips are, I'm going to give you some resources that you can have a look at in a second. Also, just support people who are already doing this. If you see someone who's doing this work well, boost the signal, retweet them, share their article, that sort of thing, because that really, really helps get the word out. And I think this is also really important for investors as well, that goal of increasing basic research. This is how we get the stuff from the bench into the point where it can be investable. So regardless of where you're coming from, I really think that sort of communicating this idea more widely and making people realize how important it is the way forward. So if you want to learn about the science, I've got a book, which was mentioned at the beginning, Ageless, The New Science of Getting Old Without Getting Old. It's aimed at people. You don't have to have any knowledge of biology to read this book. I tried to start from the very beginning, but equally, if you're a policymaker, if you're an investor, if you're a scientist, I still hope there's enough detail in there and the hundreds of references in the back that you might be able to learn something. You can find out more about that at ageless.link. There's also, which I think is of particular relevance to this talk, at ageless.link/ethics, and the clue is in the URL, a free chapter with all of the big ethical arguments that I'm commonly presented with. So if you can familiarize yourself with a few of those, you'll find yourself hopefully being able to tackle some of those questions when you get asked them. I've also got a YouTube channel. If you watch one video on it, I think that's probably the one to watch. There's one about the risks of overpopulation that I haven't had time to go into. And I'm on some of the social media. Say hello. Thank you very much.
Well, Andrew, that was brilliant. I knew you would be. That's why I put you on last in the day. A couple of comments. First of all, I don't know whether you know, but Sanjay Gupta's been saying some fairly shockingly unintelligent things about aging recently. You better give him a call. Second thing is, if you were not British, I would have had sympathy with your personal story. But as it is, why the hell did you do an interview with the Daily Mail in the first? I mean, honestly. But I do have questions. So one thing you didn't talk about is the psychological aspect. One of my favourite quotes is that Upton Sinclair thing that says it's very difficult to get someone to understand something when their salary depends on not understanding it. Now, in this case, it's not your salary. For people, most people, it's not their salary. It's their whole worldview, their self-worth and everything. And I've always believed that that is the fundamental reason why journalists sell papers by talking this bullshit, and why all the movies about the post-aging world are dystopic and so on. People want to carry on believing that aging is either a blessing in disguise or fixing it would be like perpetual motion. How do you cope with that?
It's tricky, and I think that's the main reason that I found is just to guide people through this really gently and bring them to the conclusion that it's medical research. Try not to hit them with anything too shocking at first. It is very difficult. I can't pretend that if you're in a 4-minute news slot, you can in any way communicate the nuance of this stuff and come away without someone potentially writing a headline like that. But at the same time, I think if you do give people that opportunity and try and show them just how normal this is, because it's very easy for there are so many things that you can say as an aging biologist that could immediately demarcate you as being weird in some way or another. And I think just trying to minimize those weird things while you very gently introduce people to the concepts. I think it is a challenging thing. I don't think there's a silver bullet. But I think just the more people can communicate this in the more possible ways, I think some of us are very good at chatting to other scientists. Some people are better at chatting to the public. Some people are better at chatting to different segments of the public. There are probably people of a different political persuasion, perhaps even Daily Mail readers, who I might find it harder to get through to. And so the more people can communicate this in the more diverse ways, I think that's the only way we can ultimately chip away at this problem. And what you find is that there are all kinds of issues that seemed insurmountable, that seem to be part of people's, solidly embedded in their worldview. And actually, this is a really common question I get. If we cured aging, wouldn't society just stagnate because people couldn't ever possibly change their minds? But actually, if you dig into the research, people do change their minds about all kinds of things. Gay marriage, for example, was, homosexuality was illegal in the UK until shockingly late. And yet now it's, gay marriage is widely accepted even among older cohorts. So it's simply not the case that people's minds can't be changed. It's just a slow old process, and we've got to keep battling away at it, I think.
Yeah, I especially want to reinforce what you said about the, you call it the switch, but I call it the status quo bias. I think it's a very powerful argument. But my question is, are there some people who are just hopeless? Because I spend a lot of time arguing with people on these issues like overpopulation. But that's one issue. Many people will say, well, what's the point living forever? Because of climate change, overpopulation, AI, this, that, the other. They've got a million reasons why the future is going to be terrible. Can you actually persuade those people, or do you move on to someone else who's more promising?
I think one of my favorite things to do is point out where they hold contradictory beliefs about the future that are pessimistic. So, for example, my favorite is that we'll never retire because pension ages are just going to keep on rising, but also AIs are going to take all the jobs. And I think, if you can start to unearth some of these contradictions, that's one thing. But I also think we just need to have a much sort of broader and more optimistic conversation about the future. So actually, I've been doing a lot of live tweeting of this event, and a few of the comments that I've got back on Twitter from people who aren't in this room have been about climate change, and how can you be an aging biologist and also concerned about climate change? But actually, that means we've got this enormous conversation to be had. I'm very worried about climate change. I don't think it's something that we should just sit by and not do anything about. But at the same time, I don't think telling people that we're all doomed is a particularly useful way to change hearts and minds and get the progress that we actually need. So I think this is really the challenge in whole loads of areas of science, because they impact on so much of society, so many ethical, moral, political questions. Actually, they do have to be answered in this kind of network. And so it's this slow process of convincing people that actually the future isn't going to be terrible, and I would quite like to live there.
Thanks. Yeah, I guess my question is about how you might activate someone after you've convinced them. So, I mean, I think many people have seen or participated maybe in a fun run for cancer research, but I can't imagine ever going to one for aging. I think there's many people, I guess, want to get involved if they do find this important and be able to do something. I think, pointing them towards literature or a video to inform themselves more is a great start, but I think there's a sense of maybe hopelessness about how to get involved. I can't imagine most people would come to a conference like this because it is still, maybe outside of their budget or their knowledge. Have you thought about how to approach that? Or
it's very, very hard, actually. So if you go to, there's a page on the Ageless page on my website where it was how you can help. And actually, the primary thing I've focused on is contacting political representatives, because I really think the biggest lever we've got is public funding of science. But again, this you can feel like a raindrop in a thunderstorm, because politicians get loads of emails all the time about all kinds of things. It's just a question of building up this momentum. And unfortunately, I haven't come up with a really strong magic bullet theory of change. But I think it's really important, actually. When I said keep your eyes on the prize, think about what your theory of change is. How are you hoping that, giving a talk at something like this, or, giving a talk somewhere completely different, or talking to whoever it is you're speaking to, what could actually result in them making a change in some way? We're all part of a society, and these social changes do happen. But I think, exactly how they are produced is a challenge that lots of people are struggling with. And I would love to see an Aging Research UK to go with Cancer Research UK, which is one of the largest UK charities. The reason, again, that I've gone for sort of thinking about the government angle from this is that even if I were phenomenally successful, I were to set up a research charity of the scale of Cancer Research UK, which is one of the largest charities in the world, actually. So it's a huge organisation. Then my contribution would be about the same. It's a little bit more than the British government spends on cancer research, which is about £3 per person per year. That's about €3, about $3. They're all the same these days, aren't they? So that's per person. That's a disease that's got a 30% chance of killing me, and we're spending £3 per year trying to work out why. So even if I were to have my absolute maximum level of success and somehow become a master charity administrator and create Aging Research UK, then the scale of my impact would be one small island's worth of medical research, which is obviously fantastically better than nothing. But I just think we're going to have to carry on hacking away at this problem from all kinds of different angles. I think government is a good place to go, and convincing everybody is what we need to do, because then voters will vote for this stuff, and that's ultimately how things are going to change.
Well, thank you so much, Andrew.
Thanks, Aubrey.
I know that most of us would love to stay here for the next 2 hours chatting with Andrew, and actually I'm going to stay here until the gala dinner because I don't have a tuxedo with me. So anyone who wants to hang around rather than go back to wherever you're staying and come back in time for the gala dinner, you'll have company. I also want to thank Andrew for, I don't know whether any of you know this, but he's been tweeting all day, giving little updates on what all of us have been saying, starting with me first thing in the morning, and I was most appreciative of that. Thank you for that. Thank you. So yeah, please be back here for the gala dinner, unless you're not coming, which I can't imagine you wouldn't. And otherwise, come and have a drink.
Thank you very much.